So now that you are done telling me what you think should happen to the Germany and other, countries that lost the war, we're going to actually read and find out what did happen to those countries. So we start off by reading about the Treaty of Versailles. And Versailles is actually the location of where they signed the peace treaty, made the peace treaty. A lot of times they name the treaty after where that happened. And so there's four important men we're going to read about there at the top of the page, and let's go ahead and get started. It says World War I ended at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November, 1918. In 1919, Lloyd George of England, Orlando of Italy, Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson from the U.S. met to discuss how Germany was to be made to pay for the damage World War I had caused. Wilson had devised a 14-point plan that he believed would bring stability to Europe. So this is Wilson's plan. That doesn't mean that that's actually what they did, but this is what he wanted to do. Remember, Woodrow Wilson is from the United States. So here we go. He wanted open diplomacy. He thought there should be no secret treaties between powers. He wanted freedom from navigation. So seas should be free in both peacetime and wartime. He wanted free trade. So the barriers to trade between countries, such as custom duties, should be removed. He wanted multilateral disarmament, which just basically means that he wanted the countries to reduce their armed forces to the lowest levels possible. And the people in European colonies, he wanted them to have a say in their future. We've talked about all those colonies that, like specifically the British had, and those people didn't have a lot of say in what happened in their countries anymore. So he wanted those colonies to have a say. In Russia, he thought they should be allowed to operate whatever government it wanted, and that the government should be accepted, supported, and welcomed. In Belgium, he thought it should be evacuated and restored to the situation before the war. He thought France should have Alsace-Lorraine and any lands taken away during the war restored, so they should get their land back. In Italy, he thought the Italian border should be readjusted according to nationality. And in the topic of national self-determination, he thought that national groups in Europe should, wherever possible, be given their independence. In Romania, Montenegro, and Serbia, he thought they should be evacuated and that Serbia should have an outlet to the sea, meaning they would redraw the country borders for that country and make it so that the border would be on the sea at some point so that they could go right from their land to the ocean or the sea for that situation. We talked about that before, and we're going to talk about that more when you get back to school. Turkey, he thought the people of Turkey should have a say in their future. In Poland, he thought they should become an independent state with an outlet to the sea. And he thought there should be a League of Nations developed, which would be an assembly of all the nations, so all the countries, formed to protect world peace in the future. On the next page, it says Germany expected a treaty based on these 14 points. However, negotiations between the Big Four, which included Lloyd George of England, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of America, did not go smoothly. Wilson believed that his 14 points was the only way to secure everlasting peace. The French, however, wanted the defeated nations to be punished severely and believed Wilson's plan was too lenient, so they thought it was going way too easy on the losers of the war. Privately, Lloyd George sided with Wilson, although he was concerned about the threat from communism. However, the British public, like Clemenceau, wanted Germany punished severely. Lloyd George knew that if he sided with Wilson, he would lose the next election. After prolonged discussion, an agreement was eventually reached, and the Germans were summoned to Versailles to sign the treaty. So they told them, come to Versailles, it's time to sign the treaty. The final treaty bore little resemblance to Wilson's 14 points. So in other words, the final treaty really didn't look a lot like the 14 points that we discussed on the previous page. It says at the bottom, although Germany was not happy with the treaty, they had little choice but to sign. The cartoon clearly shows the situation Germany was in. So if you look at that cartoon, you've got the nations on the right are the guys holding the spoon. And in the spoon, there's a little pill that says peace terms. So basically, the nations that won are feeding peace terms to, and that person represents Germany. And they're being held by that big strong hand. So they're wanting Germany to basically swallow the pill and accept their peace terms, whether they like it or not. Okay, let's talk about what those terms are. We're not just going to talk about Germany, but other countries too. It says there were a total of 440 clauses in the final treaty. The first 26 clauses dealt with the establishment of the League of Nations. The remaining 414 clauses spelled out Germany's punishment. So 414 of the 440 were Germany's punishments. So the general clauses, so general things that had to be done. They did want to establish a League of Nations. And then there was this thing called the War Guilt Clause where Germany had to accept blame for starting the war. That is going to be really hard for Germany to want to do. Then there were financial clauses, so having to do with money. Germany was to pay for the damage caused by the war. The figure of 6,600 pounds, which actually 6,600 million pounds, was set sometime after the signing of the treaty. That equivalates to about $33 billion in US money, and they were not able to repay that money until 2010, 92 years after the war was over. So that's wild, isn't it? Okay, some of the military clauses. Their army was to be reduced to 100,000 men, and they were not allowed to have tanks anymore. Their navy was only to be allowed to have 6 ships and no submarines. Their air force was not allowed to even exist. They couldn't have an air force. And then Rhineland, there was an area called the Rhineland area, was to be kept free of German military personnel and weapons. And so they're territorial clauses, so clauses that have to do with the areas. And it says Anschluss. Germany was not allowed to unite with Austria and with the land. Germany lost land to a number of other countries. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Eupen and Malmedy were given to Belgium. North Schleswig was given to Denmark. Land was also taken from Germany and given to Czechoslovakia and Poland. The League of Nations took control of Germany's colonies. So that map below shows you the land that Germany lost, and you can see that the middle shaded gray was demilitarized, meaning there was no more military allowed to be there. The lighter gray was lost by Germany, and then the black voted to stay or remain German. And again, we'll look at those maps once you return to school and see really what happened to Germany and the other countries. So speaking of the other countries, the other defeated nations, these are some of the things that they had to agree to in the peace treaty. The Treaty of Versailles determined the punishment that Germany should face. Other treaties determined the fate of those countries that had fought with Germany: Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. Austria and Hungary were divided and therefore signed separate treaties. So they're no longer a country together, they're now separate. And so Austria's consequences are this. In the land, Austria lost land to Italy, Czechoslovakia, and Serbia. Their army was reduced to 30,000 men. Anschluss, basically a union with Germany was forbidden. So they were not allowed to unite with Germany. And then they also had to pay reparations, but they went bankrupt before they could even set the amount of money they were going to have to pay. So there's that. Now Hungary, now that it's separate from Austria, signed the Treaty of Trianon on the 4th of June. Their land. Hungary lost land to Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Serbia, which reduced its size from 283,000 square kilometers to less than 93,000 square kilometers. Population was reduced from 18.2 million to 7.6 million. So they reduced their population and their country size significantly. The army had to be reduced to 35,000 men, and for reparations, Hungary was to pay reparations, but they never set an amount. And then there's Bulgaria, and they signed their treaty in November of 1919. The land they lost, it says Bulgaria lost land to Greece, Romania, and Yugoslavia. They had to pay reparations. It said Bulgaria had to pay 90 million pounds of reparations. And then the army, there were restrictions made on the size of their army, but it doesn't say specifically what that was. And then last, our good old friend Turkey. Turkey was, they signed their treaty in 1920. They lost land to Greece, and the League of Nations took control of their colonies, so their colonies that were in other locations. All right, so your job now is to answer some of these questions, and I encourage you to go back into the reading if you're having any trouble. So the first question is, why didn't they make the treaty based on Wilson's 14 points? The second question, what are 3 ways that the Treaty of Versailles affected Germany? So what were 3 of their consequences? Any of those 3, there's several listed on the page. And then the last one is give an example of how another country was affected by the Treaty of Versailles. So the last page I just read you talked about 4 different countries: Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, and what their consequences were. So tell me which country you're talking about, and then tell me one thing that they had a consequence for. The last thing you need to do is watch this short video clip. This is not of me, so it's a little more exciting. It talks about the end of World War I. It's just a few minutes long. And what I want you to do is just look for one important fact that you learned while you're watching the video and record that in the box. Okay, so tomorrow we'll talk more about America's part in all of this peace treaty business. Please let me know if you have any questions by email.